My name is John McLaughlin. I'm a branch secretary of the trade union Unison in Tower Hamlets in East London, but I've also been involved in Defend Council housing since 1996. And there'll be many other people who have been involved in campaigning in the housing in the last 30 or 40 years. And tonight's meeting is about justice for Grenfell, but it's also about what Grenfell says about the crisis in housing, and particularly social housing, that there is in Britain. And so wherever a moment for change, this is it. As I said, Grenfell, what everybody knows, this is not a natural disaster. It's not even avoidable. This was a tragedy that was created by not listening to tenants and by 30 or more years of privatisation and deregulation. One of the things that made me most sick, because it spoke back to all my experience since 1996 on housing campaigning, was when I heard Nicholas Paget Brown, the ex-leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council. And when he said, we gave the tenants a choice. We said to them, you can have a sprinkler system, but if you do, you'll have to wait for your bathroom and your kitchen. And no one should ever be placed in that choice. We want a bedroom, we want a bathroom, and we want a sprinkler system. We want for houses that are safe, that are affordable. So this is a moment where we'll bring together part of this alliance. It's trade unionists, it's tenants, we'll all be speaking. But this is a moment for action. It's a moment that cries out, something must be done, not just about justice for those victims, but we've got to change the crisis of social housing in this country. We've got 4 speakers on the platform, and then we'll have plenty of time for contribution to debate. I'm going to introduce them as they come to speak. My first speaker is Moyra Samuels. Moyra lives very close to Grenfell Towers, and she's been very involved from the very first moment in the Justice for Grenfell campaign. So please welcome Moyra to the meeting.
Thank you, everybody, for inviting me to tonight's meeting. I'd like to start off by just introducing myself. I'm a teacher, member of the NUT, and I've lived in North Kensington for 30 years. I'm not a survivor, I'm not an evacuee, but I lived 300 metres from Grenfell. So it's been 4 weeks, and tonight we are having, the community around Grenfell are having a vigil to commemorate 4 weeks since the fire. So I'm afraid when I'm finished speaking, I'm going to have to leave to attend. So I do apologise now. So it's 4 weeks for the community of North Kensington. 4 weeks when many of us woke up, stood and watched in horror and helplessness while Grenfell burned. A lot of us listened to the screams. We saw people at the windows, and some of us saw people jump. And it was a horrific experience that actually has left the community of North Kensington with a huge range of trauma and exhaustion. So if I stumble and forget my words, I'm sorry. It's just 4 weeks of running around and managing and coping with what's happened. We were humbled as a community because the whole of London came out to support us. Actually, the country came out to support us. And communities of all different faiths, no faiths, provided food, water, clothing, all sorts of things. And in particular, I think our community are really grateful to the Muslim community because it was the middle of Ramadan and they provided food for people day in and day out as they broke their fast with us. And a lot of us believe that if it wasn't Ramadan, more people would have died in that fire because a lot of people were up because of Ramadan. So in the days that followed, the community experienced horror, anguish, grief, and managing all the donations. A lot of it was done on the ground by volunteers and by people in the community. But a few days after the fire, our anguish and horror was also tinged with huge rage. And that rage was twofold. Our rage, firstly, and anger, was because we had said that the Grenfell Action Group had said that Grenfell was a fire waiting to happen. So when it did happen, we were shocked, but not surprised. And I'd like to read a quote from the Grenfell Action blog, which actually describes this. It's called KC, which is Kensington and Chelsea Tenants Management Organisation, Playing with Fire. It is truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believe that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord, the KCTMO, and bring an end to the dangerous living conditions and neglect of health and safety legislation that they inflict upon their tenants and leaseholders. This was written in 2016, and a lot of us who are local activists were very aware of the concern that actually Grenfell Action Group had made. They were ignored, they were dismissed, they were threatened with solicitors' letters. Some of them even had their characters, they were told they were drunks and, and crazy people. So that was one of the reasons why our rage grew. The second reason was that 2 or 3 days after we'd all been running around, we suddenly turned around and said, sorry, where is our council? Don't we actually have a council here? Where are they? And we kept looking for them, but we realized that this was the self-same council that had been inflicting cut after cut, starvation of services, starvation of amenities within North Kensington's community. And therefore, the contempt, the arrogance was just a continuation of what they'd done to us before. I'd just like to give a couple of examples. A wonderful nursery called Maxilla, very close to Grenfell, actually, 200 metres from Grenfell, outstanding according to Ofsted, was closed. Apparently they claimed that there was pollution. There was too much pollution in the Westway. The nursery had been around for 30 years, so it didn't seem to matter they'd polluted children for 30 years. We mounted a fight and we lost. We had a stables that was built also as part of the Westway for working class children to actually ride a horse, something they wouldn't be able to do under any other circumstances. That was starved of funds and eventually closed. We had a venue that the community used to meet in for music. That was actually the people who ran it were given a 3-month lease, and that they had to give that up. So there's no way for music, especially Caribbean, African music in the area. They also, this is how cheeky they are, leased our library to a Notting Hill prep school for £9,000 a year, without consultation with the community. And that's still an ongoing fight that we're having. But also with regard to housing, right opposite Grenfell, there are 3 towers called Silchester. And their plans are to actually, their preferred option as they called it, is to demolish 3 tower blocks where 1,500 people live. People who have been there, communities who have been there for decades, generations, and elderly people who are going to have to be shifted out. So that was one of the other campaigns that we were fighting. So when I say that we actually developed an enormous rage, it was in this kind of context that actually our rage developed. A number of us took to the streets and demonstrated. But also, out of this rage came the Justice for Grenfell campaign. It's 4 weeks old. We have some key demands, and those, we may add some to them or we may actually, hopefully, some of those demands would have been met and they'll actually come off our demands. And these are our demands. The first demand is that the survivors and some of the evacuees are housed within Kensington and Chelsea and are not moved out. Kensington and Chelsea have 1,400 empty properties. We've ascertained that. And we are determined that whatever it takes, whether they have to requisition, whether they have to use their 300 million reserve, they need to buy or do what they can so that actually the survivors are housed within the borough. So that's the key demand at the moment. Up to now, 18 families. 18 families have been housed. And just shows you the extent of the chaos that we're still living through. The second demand that we have is that a number of the undocumented survivors and those survivors who are in the process of their asylum applications, that they should be given a complete and utter amnesty. Because there's quite a few of them. Theresa May has only suggested a year, but obviously we're going to fight that and demand that is a complete amnesty. We also are demanding that the personal, social and emotional needs of the survivors are met. Because, you know, in the middle of this trauma, we keep hearing stories. A lot of the survivors are isolated in their hotels. A lot of them are very traumatized. A lot of them are suicidal. There's an enormous amount of survivor guilt. And a lot of those emotional needs are not being met. So that's something we need to make sure that we're actually not forgetting. We also, given, as I've described, our anger at our local authority, are determined that all those members, whether it be the Tenants Management Organisation or the council members who approved the cladding or had a hand in the cost-cutting exercise or refused sprinklers or didn't manage the fire safety, that those people are held accountable and are prosecuted. We call it corporate massacre. Some people call it social murder. The other demand that we have is for the inquiry. And we are determined that the inquiry will not be narrowed to looking at the cladding and the safety issue, however important they are and however significant they are in terms of the death. What happened to the community around Grenfell is about what happened before the fire, as I said, what's happened during the fire, and what happened after the fire, and how that community is still being treated, how those survivors and evacuees are still being treated. So we want the remit to be broad of the inquiry. We don't want it to be narrowed down just to looking at the safety. We also are very suspicious and have absolutely no trust in the judge. We believe he's a social cleansing judge. We have no trust in the chair. There we go. So we are saying that actually we will not have a judge or a chair who made cuts to the approved cuts to the fire service. We will not have people imposed on us in terms of the inquiry. We will have a right to select somebody who we think will represent the concerns of the community. And we've had some push, we've had some success with the push because they wanted us to put in all our concerns and questions for the inquiry by this Friday. We said, seriously? There are people walking around and some people don't even have vouchers, the survivors don't even have vouchers for food. And you're wanting us to put forward in some kind of legal form our concerns for the inquiry. So we managed to push that back to two weeks, the 28th. So the campaign is having some successes. I think in general, I just want to say there's been a change of mood in the country since the election. And if any borough knows that, it's our borough. Look, we called in last. Our first MP for 44 years, we've got our first Labour MP, and she got in by 20 votes. We worked, local activists, Labour Party, a whole range in a united way. We worked hard to get Emma elected. And I think the change in North Kensington is not just about the change in North Kensington, it's a change right across the country. I think we've had enough. We've really had enough of systematic cuts. We've had enough of social cleansing. We have to actually have residents' voices beginning to be heard and those voices to be, those concerns to be taken notice of. We're tired of the cuts to schools, cuts to our NHS. And we believe that actually austerity kills. And this is what Grenfell is about. And I think that it's time that we got together and demanded that the working class no longer pay for the profits of the government or the big property developers. So can I finish by saying we need your support. This is going to be a tough campaign, so we will be coming to you for support in all sorts of different ways. At the moment, we also have a demonstration arranged. I wish it wasn't arranged. We've called a demonstration of Kensington Council on the 19th of July, and I'd like to ask people to come and support us. It's at 6 o'clock at the town hall. We want our voices heard because the last council meeting they had, they wouldn't allow us in. So I'd like to invite everybody to come and support us and to help us to fight for justice for Grenfell. Thank you.
Thank you, Moyra. And I think I can speak on behalf of the whole meeting when I ask you to take to that vigil at Grenfell the solidarity and the love, but more than anything, the commitment of this community and other communities to stand by the victims in fighting for justice. My next speaker comes from a union which will be familiar to people. The victims, the people who were murdered in Grenfell, came from many backgrounds. 2 were members of my own union. 2 were also members of the National Union of Teachers. Our next speaker has represented teachers not just in fighting for what happens to them at work, but the massive issue that teachers and other workers, particularly in London, have about trying to find affordable housing. So I'm very, very pleased indeed to welcome next Kevin Courtney, the General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak at this meeting of Defend Council Housing. I was going to start by trying to make a moral case about why trades unionists and teacher trades unionists in particular should be involved in this campaign for justice for Grenfell, but I think Moyra has made that, and I'm really proud of the work that Moyra has done as a resident, but as a member of the NUT as well, throwing herself into all the efforts that happened there. I think it's vital that my union is involved in this campaign around housing and around justice for Grenfell, and John has just touched on one of the reasons. We know that teachers in London are renters like everybody else. Nobody can afford to buy. We did a survey in 2015, and of teachers in their first 5 years of their career, 10% of them are buying, 67% are renting, 20% are still living with their parents. Most of the ones who are renting say they will leave London within 5 years. So there's another issue around, whether we'll have enough teachers unless we do something to sort out this housing crisis. But because of those numbers, I knew the day we saw the fire, I'd had a strong suspicion that we would have had members who were in the tower because teachers are renters. So I asked somebody, and I felt bad about this the next day. I'm the General Secretary of the union, so I deploy staff, and I asked somebody to check the membership database. And when they did, they found that there were 3 names of members of our union that were on that database, and I regretted asking that person to do it because it was actually a very emotionally charged thing I asked that person to do. She was fine. And actually, all three of our members are alive. One of them had left the tower 2 months before and just hadn't, we followed through, we talked to their school reps, so one of them had left the tower 2 months before. One of them got out with her immediate family, but her brother died 6 floors above her. Another got out, went to hospital, but all of her immediate neighbours died. So these stories are terrible for everybody involved, but the survivors, they feel an enormous sense of guilt about the position they're in. And my union will now, and other unions have got members there and are similarly following through with their members, and we're trying to support those people who won't go back to school for some time, but we're trying to help them in a way the council hasn't yet managed to do, with finding accommodation, etc. So that's our reason why we have to be involved in this. Our members are in there. But there's also the question of the children in the schools around the tower. And housing has been an issue for teachers in London schools for some years now. When we hear stories about people facing the bedroom tax, having to move because of the bedroom tax, or because a private landlord has jacked the rent up and they can't afford it, not always visible is the fact that that often means a parent having to move away from the school and a child ripped out of the community of their classmates, ripped away from their friendship groups. Sometimes parents are travelling. I mean, my partner was a primary teacher in Hackney, and there were parents who were moved to Enfield or further out and were travelling in every day to bring their child to be with the friendship groups. Others couldn't do that in their circumstances. And I tell you, that is a terrible thing to do to a child, to rip them out of their community in that way. So housing has been an issue for some time for teachers. And we see it all the more now in this situation around Grenfell. So I think that any parent, displaced survivor from Grenfell, who wants to stay close enough, they have to be allowed to stay so their children can go back to school with the teachers they're familiar with their classmates, so that they're not put in the position of being ripped out of those communities. Some parents might not want that, and that should be their decision. But I'm not talking about learning here. I'm not saying a child will learn better if they're in that school, although I think they probably would. But I'm saying they shouldn't be stolen from their community. They shouldn't lose all of their friends in that school. So they should be allowed to stay, whatever the cost. They should be allowed to stay in that borough if that's what they choose. And that's why my union, National Union of Teachers, together with the National Association of Head Teachers, the Association of Education Psychologists, we wrote to the government the weekend after the tragedy, and the Association of Teachers and Lecturers, to make this case that for the children, the parents must be allowed to stay. They must be given to high quality accommodation in the area if that's what they want. That's in the interests of their children. Teachers across London and across the country and their children across London were frightened by what happened at Grenfell. And their teachers responded, I think, magnificently, organised a Green for Grenfell Day on the Friday a week afterwards and collected hundreds of thousands of pounds as part of the relief efforts. And you see the efforts of ordinary people, ordinary children in schools, their ordinary teachers, to make a real effort to try and put things right in a way we never can, but an attempt to put things right. And I think ordinary people showing themselves in great light in that. And the third reason why my union needs to be involved in this fight is the question of the regulations that led to that fire killing those people. The same sorts of regulations apply in our schools. So we wrote to the government, along with the Fire Brigades Union, the National Union of Teachers and the Fire Brigades Union, wrote to the government in October last year, because the government then in October was reducing the presumption in favour of sprinklers in schools. And hardly any new schools built since 2010 have had sprinklers put in them. The academy at the base of the tower, there's an academy school at the base of the tower. It's had to be, it wasn't damaged particularly in the fire, but the kids have been dispersed. The teachers are working very hard with those children. That school in inner London, where fires do happen, and is on several floors, had no fire sprinklers. Nobody can tell me that a school in inner London over several floors, that you would say that was low risk, and therefore that everybody could get out really easily and you wouldn't have fire sprinklers. An absolute disgrace that that building doesn't have fire sprinklers. And when we were looking back at the notes of the meeting where we had, along with members from the Fire Brigades Union, with the government arising from October, we then looked and saw the fact that there were other presumptions being relaxed as well. There was a presumption that you should compartmentalise tower blocks and you should compartmentalise schools so that fire can't spread, so that fire can be retrained for some time while people have got time to get out. And they reduced the presumption that there would be significant compartmentalisation. And in the same set of things, they reduced the presumption that cladding would be fire resistant. And in fact, we believe, I guess it wouldn't have made a whole lot of difference, seeing as all the cladding seems to be as disgraceful as it is at Grenfell. But the cladding on the tower matches the cladding on the school. And the school was clad first, and we think to some degree, the decisions were made at the same time. So the question of safety of children in schools, of their staff, the teachers and the support staff in schools, it can't be separated out easily from the question of the protection of people in tower blocks. The same legislation is applying. My union insists there have to be fire sprinklers. Maybe in a one-form entry school with doors all the way out, maybe there is a school somewhere where you can get away without having fire sprinklers. But we want fire sprinklers, we want compartmentalisation, and we insist that cladding must not be something that's going to go up like a Roman candle. And I just want to end by making the broader point that other people have made, because I think it can't go unsaid. The people who run the council in Kensington and Chelsea would never, ever have lived in a tower block without fire sprinklers, without fire retardant cladding on the outside of that building. They don't live in the same places as teachers. They don't live in the same places as the children those teachers teach. And they've got a different take on the world. We have to see this as a break point. Stop the deregulation. Stop the insane moves towards privatisation. Let's say human life matters, that teachers' lives matter, that the other trades unionists in that building, all the ordinary people in that building, their lives matter, the children in our schools matter, their lives matter. Stop this insane deregulation. Let's insist that we get a proper outcome from this. Justice for Grenfell, justice for the rest of the working class in this country. Let's have proper fire systems in place, proper housing for people. Thank you.
Thank you. We're meeting tonight in Camden, and Camden housing has featured very greatly on national news over the last few weeks for obvious reasons. And you'll see the banner there of Camden Unison. One thing I think people who live in Camden should be very proud of is that Camden is one of the boroughs where tenants and trade unionists working together stopped the transfer of council housing, and it remains council housing in Camden. And perhaps it's no coincidence that the blocks they had to evacuate, the Chalcott Towers, are the only blocks in Camden refurbished under a private finance initiative. Amidst the horror of Grenfell, there was also some inspiration. Firstly and foremost, in the working class community that came together, irrespective of race or religion or sex or sexuality, who worked together in solidarity. But there was also the inspiration of all the emergency services, but not least of the firefighters, who went into that terrible blazing tower to do what they could to save people. So I'm very, very pleased indeed that our final speaker is the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, Matt Wrack.
Well, friends, sisters and brothers, it is a pleasure to speak here. It's a challenge to speak here, but I'm proud to speak here because our union stands in solidarity with the victims of Grenfell Tower, with the residents who are displaced, and with people fighting for decent housing wherever they may be. We're supporters of Defend Council housing long before this happened. And I think it is right that actually the past 4 weeks we have seen the best and the worst of things. We have seen the worst of things in the horror that happened that night and the lives that were destroyed. We've seen the worst of things in the response of those people who should be charged with looking after that community. And I mean very clearly the local authority, the Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, who have completely failed in their duty to look after those residents. But I also mean in terms of central government, who have completely failed to look after those residents. It seems to me, and I've been to Grenfell Tower several times, including in the immediate, while the incident was still going on, and visited the streets around, where we could see the local community and people from across London coming together on an ad hoc basis to organise themselves to bring together food and clothing and resources. And I looked around and said, where the hell are the people in charge of this? Because there was nobody in charge. People had to organise themselves. And it was absolutely, it was inspirational on the one hand, but it was shocking at that complete failure of the so-called authorities to get to get a grip of this. So for us, the starting point for what we want to see next is around the idea of justice. We want to see justice around this horror that has happened in the middle of our capital city. Justice primarily for the victims and the residents of Grenfell Tower and that estate, and also for our members who were put into an absolutely appalling and horrific situation. And this does have to be a turning point. We cannot allow things to go on as they have, because it's been said before by other speakers already, but this was not an act of God. This was not ordained from on high that this had to happen. When we investigate it, we will find that there are decisions that were made that have led to this happening. A whole series of decisions, and those decisions were made by people in authority. They are political decisions. So the truth is, this is a political matter. And we need to trace back, step by step, all those political decisions that have had an impact on this fire happening in this way, in that area, and on the response to it, and all the failings that have arisen as a result. In terms of my own union, we of the people who... I represent people across the UK in the fire rescue service. In the London Fire Brigade, we represent around 95% of the uniformed workforce. And in terms of people on the front line, it will be much higher than that. So I can tell you that virtually you could probably count on one hand the number of people who went into that tower that night who were not members of the Fire Brigades Union. So they are our members who went in that night. But our union campaigns, like other unions, on our members' pay and conditions and pensions, and they've been under attack in recent years. But we've also, throughout our history, campaigned around wider public safety issues, because we want people to be safe in their homes. We were the pioneers on the question of safety standards in relation to furniture, and which has saved thousands of lives since winning changes in that. And again, under this government, we've seen attempts to water down some of the protections in terms of foam-filled furniture that protect people, are part of protecting people in their homes. And in terms of what those firefighters did, and I will take a couple of minutes to just say something about that, because having, and I'm sure I know a number of you have been to visit Grenfell Tower, but seeing it on the television as I did as it was unfolding that night, and then visiting it, I'd say are two starkly different things. To see it in real life is truly horrific. And the firefighters who went there that night went there with, they're trained, they've got equipment, they've got specialist skills, they've got breathing apparatus. None of that makes them superheroes, by the way. They are human beings who have a physiology and who can do certain things that maybe the other people can't do with that equipment, but it doesn't, as I say, make them superhuman. They are trained to deal with certain situations. And compartmentalisation has been mentioned. We expect that when we go into a tower block, that the flats have been built to contain a fire within that flat of origin. It shouldn't spread. There are fire protecting walls, fire protecting ceilings, fire protecting floors, and fire protecting doors. That's how those blocks of flats were built. And a lot of architects are now coming out to make that point, that when these flats were built, the architects who designed them built them to those standards. So when firefighters are trained about how do you deal with a fire in a residential block of flats, they have certain procedures that they will follow. They will normally, by the way, take a lift to the floor below or the 2 floors below. They have a rising main. They can plug water in at the bottom, pump the water up, take the water out, and go into the flat and put a fire out. And in many, I worked in Hackney for many years, where there were lots of residential tower blocks, and in many cases, people living the floor above wouldn't even know a fire had taken place because firefighters had used those procedures to put the fire out. But on this occasion, the people attending that incident attended an incident that should not have happened. In fact, people thought it was impossible to happen. And that phrase has been used to me. That's impossible. It's impossible for that to happen. Clearly, it wasn't impossible. So turning up to an incident that you don't expect, and therefore you haven't planned for, and therefore you haven't trained for, and therefore your equipment is meaningless in some degrees. You've got nothing to deal with that, a fire on that scale. And to me, the more stories I hear of those people, it is truly remarkable what they did. One firefighter described to me that they used the many decades of experience that they had to cobble together ways of dealing with something that they hadn't thought was ever going to happen. And when you can't apply the procedures that are intended to keep you safe, and you can't apply the normal practices that are intended to keep you safe, then effectively people are making it up as they go along. And that was happening on that night. And I'll just a couple of examples. People are in breathing apparatus are not supposed to remove their breathing apparatus, because if a firefighter collapses, they're no use to anybody. But they did, because they provided their own breathing apparatus masks to members of the public. Firefighters aren't supposed to split up their teams, but they did split up their teams. Firefighters are not supposed to get lost, but they did get lost. And it is a miracle that we didn't lose large numbers of firefighters that night. Firefighters, in our view, shouldn't be wearing breathing apparatus more than once. When you wear breathing apparatus, it affects the whole physiology of the body. The British Heart Foundation just this year did research on that. It turns your blood sticky and increases the likelihood. So this is fit, healthy people who have to meet certain fitness standards. It turns their blood sticky and increases the likelihood of a heart attack. So wearing once does that to you. Wearing breathing apparatus twice increases that risk. And on this occasion, people went in once and twice and 3 times into that building. So it's absolutely clear to me that those people, and what still quite staggering when you think about it, is very consciously and very deliberately put their own lives at risk in terms of their response that night. So we have a very clear interest in finding out how this could happen when it shouldn't happen. And it just strikes me that actually this country has a huge wealth of knowledge about architecture, huge wealth of knowledge about building construction, huge wealth of knowledge about fire protection of buildings. It's all there. So how, despite that knowledge, can this still happen in one of the richest countries in the world? And how is it that, we're talking about resources, how this country, by the way, can send a guided missile down a street and tell it to turn left halfway across the world, and yet can't keep people safe in their own homes? And that is an utter disgrace as far as I'm concerned. And when you look at why it happened, what we've seen over decades, people say, is this a cause of austerity? Well, austerity is part of it, but it is wider and longer than austerity. We have seen for decades an assault on council housing. We have seen for decades an assault on local authorities. In local authorities, we have planning departments. We also have, or used to have, building control. Building control who are supposed to ensure that buildings meet the building regulations, including the fire safety elements of those building regulations. But building control has been decimated in local authorities and privatised, so that people can go outside of the local authority to get building control permissions if they want to do developments or build buildings. And we had one example. We employ a fire engineer in our union who told us of a case before he worked for us of a hospital where they'd got the building control permission, and the fire service, this is the London Fire Brigade, people think the London Fire Brigade's got some sort of veto on things. The London Fire Brigade visited and said, we've now got a problem with access for fire engines under your plans. And the building control, private building control guy said, well, thanks very much for your comments and observations, but this is what we're going to do. You will have to run out longer hose if there is an incident. That just highlights the scale of the problem that we have. So building control has been decimated. Fire safety inspectors. When I joined the fire service in 1983, we had large numbers of specialist teams of fire inspecting officers. It's a very skilled part of the fire and rescue service. We estimate that since 2005, we've lost between a half and 2/3 of those specialist teams. So it's therefore no surprise that the number of fire safety inspections, and now called audits, that are undertaken are reduced, particularly by 25% since 2010. And they are required to carry out what are called a risk-based programme of fire safety audits. And again, what somebody said to me is, well, you can have a risk, if you've got 100 fire inspecting officers, well, you can have one level of risk-based audit. If you've only got 10 of them left, you can still call it a risk-based audit programme, but it's a very different risk-based audit from when you had 100 of them, because the 10 are doing a fraction of the work that 100 were doing before. So the government calls it a risk-based programme of fire audit. It's nothing like what existed before. You then have a concerted campaign against regulation from central government. I don't know if people saw it, the Local Government Association conference last week, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government described this as a failure of local government. And it strikes me there is a concerted effort to shift the blame from central government to local government. Well, local government may have a role to play in this and may bear responsibility. But I tell you what, we shouldn't be letting any central government ministers off the hook for the decisions that they've made over this. And this public inquiry needs to forensically examine each single decision that ministers have made in recent years that have deregulated housing, have deregulated safety, and those people need to be held responsible, and if they're found to be responsible, then they should be kicked out of office straight away. Because we've had this campaign against regulation and what they call red tape, and we had a the last Prime Minister who described health and safety as a monster that needed to be slain. And they don't think that when they say this sort of stuff, you're creating a culture where your civil servants then, when anyone, and not just the Fire Brigades Union, but other people who are interested in sprinklers or other fire safety mechanisms, they run into a brick wall when they raise that with the advisors and the central lead civil servants advising the minister, well, we can't do that because if you want a new regulation here, you've got to get rid of 3 other regulations over there. And that is their mantra all the time. Get 2 in, 1 out, or 3 in, 1 out. You can't increase new regulations. So a Prime Minister who describes things in that way. And that has created the culture whereby these and you put all of that together over decades and subcontracting in local authorities, because it'd be interesting to know how this contract was even awarded, who then did the work, who the subcontractors were, whether anyone can even pin back how any of this happened. We used to have direct labour organisations in local authorities where you could hold people to account. They weren't perfect, but at least you knew who was doing the work. And the local authority, which was in theory accountable to its local community, could then control its own workforce. That world is almost completely gone in this day and age. And that deregulation, again, I'll say something about my own service. Again, we've had complete deregulation in the fire and rescue service. Not just under this government, I have to say under the last government and under the government before that, under the new Labour government as well. We used to have a body called the Central Fire Brigades Advisory Council, and it had subcommittees on things like fire safety and fire protection. And it might have spotted things like this about cladding on buildings. Let's commission some research to do about that. What's the best way of tackling it, both in terms of planning, and what's the best way of tackling it in terms of how you respond to it if there is a fire. That structure was abolished in 2004, and there is nothing that exists like that today. Basically, you've got a free-for-all across the fire and rescue service across the UK, where each fire service sets its own standards, develops its own equipment, and so on. Research. You might think, because there have been very serious fires in tower blocks around the world that have involved cladding, and you might have thought that, well, actually, why doesn't someone do some research? Because there's this big debate on the TV now about cladding and what impact it has had. Why don't we do some research, independent, government-funded research, that looks at what the risks of applying cladding to building are, and also looks at the question of how you apply that cladding to the building. But of course, there is no such research anymore in Britain. It's all gone. The former Communities and Local Government Department had research teams and would commission research. They've all gone, and that was under austerity. So that all of this adds up to creating a situation whereby this can happen. And then you come to the actual operational response to that incident that night. And we, in the early days of this incident, were very careful. I am still very careful what I say about this. But I can say that firefighters who were on that first response of the local fire stations, because we have lost something like 50% of the fire cover within 4 miles of that tower block in recent years, in cuts forced through by Boris Johnson, now the Foreign Secretary, who, but again, it tells you something about the culture of these people, that when the vote took place on those cuts, and he was challenged by Andrew Dismore. Andrew Dismore's a GLA member, used to be a solicitor who used to work for us, who worked on the King's Cross inquiry. So Andrew Dismore is someone who knows something about fire safety and about the fire service. And Johnson's response was to tell him to get stuffed in a question time meeting and then think it's a big joke. So fire safety for these people, it seems to me, is either something that should be dismissed or treated as a joke. And that sums up the contempt with which they hold many of us in this society. So, in terms of what we need to do, I think this public inquiry cannot be allowed to be a cover-up. We're working on our terms of reference response. We want to work closely with the residents and tenants groups about that. But I think we need to say, so the inquiry needs to be an opportunity for a complete turning point in policy in relation to housing and public safety in Britain today. It seems to me, housing goes to the heart of it. You take, Kevin's mentioned teachers and housing. What's happened to firefighters and housing? I think less than 40% of London firefighters now live in London. And what they do and they were able to do that because they work shifts. So they commute for 2, 3, 4 hours a day to get into work. And that's a big chunk of the London workforce are now living miles and miles and miles away from where they work because you can't afford to live in London. Or we have the horror of the private rented sector, where people are treated by complete rip-off landlords with no decent rights, in appalling conditions, kicked out at the drop of a hat, and this onslaught again against council housing. And they talk about, I've seen one response that we should tear down all the high-rises. Now, I don't know what the answer to that is, but it is certainly not impossible that we can build and maintain decent accommodation, safe accommodation in high-rise buildings. There are wealthy people. There are wealthy people here and across the world who live in high-rise buildings and who don't suffer the same threats that the people at Grenfell Tower did. The problem is actually the onslaught against public space, the onslaught against public housing, and the onslaught against the public sector. And we have to take this opportunity to turn things around. We should be part of building a new mass democratic and fighting tenants organisations across the country to fight for the rights of tenants in the public and the private sector, linking up with trade unions. Trade unions have an interest in local government, in teaching, in the fire service to fight for decent housing for the members who live in our communities, but also for our own people and for the next generation. So this horror, I think the best tribute that we can pay to the people who have died in such a horrific way is to fight for justice for them, but actually to fight for a fundamental change in this society that provides and sets out, we want decent housing, safe housing for everyone as of right. Get rid of the market out of all of this, and actually decent housing for all is entirely possible. It's a question of changing the balance of power in society, it seems to me. And if that's what needs to be done, so be it. Thanks very much.